morning. I'd like to start by thanking everybody for the invitation. It's the first public speaking opportunity I've had since I've been in Boulder, and it's definitely the first virtual public speaking opportunity I've had. I have a pretty long history of public speaking in person, but this is the first time I've addressed a group like this way. So as we go through, if you find you're having issues with the pace of my voice or clarity, please just identify it in the chat, and either Gabriel or I will hopefully catch it, and I can fix it. And likewise, if you need me to repeat something, please point that out. And if you have questions, drop them in, and we can try and address them as they come up. They might be fresh in my mind if I address them as they come up rather than waiting until the end. So I scratched out a few lines of my introduction because Gabriel took care of it. The last little couple of things that are somewhat pertinent to today. I came to Colorado by way of Canada, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan to be precise. I completed an honors degree in history at the University of Saskatchewan in May 2018, and then I moved to Colorado 3 months later. I'm also a reserve officer in the Canadian military. And up until about 15 minutes before this presentation, I was wearing a uniform and working out of Microsoft Teams, running staff meetings and all sorts of chaos. So if I'm a little more scatterbrained than normal, I apologize, but the brain is still rewiring itself to talk about sports. Speaking of which, I'm a huge sports fan. Love it, especially baseball. I have been a hockey fan my entire life. I used to love the NBA. When Michael Jordan left the Bulls, my heart broke, and I was kind of done with basketball, although I still watch college basketball and I go to every Buffaloes game I can. But baseball is my, if I have a one true love of sports, it's baseball. And for some of you, this might speak highly to my character, and for others among you, it might disqualify me from having opinions on baseball, but I wear my pinstripes on my heart. I'm a Yankees fan through and through, so this season's been really tough. And that Yankees fandom kind of led me into the first player I want to talk about. And we've mentioned it's going to be Hank Greenberg. One of the great what ifs in baseball history is what the careers of certain players would look like if it wasn't for the interruptions of wartime service during the Second World War. For the Yankees, the player whose numbers in career might look most different is Joe DiMaggio, the Yankee Clipper. Joltin' Joe missed 3 full seasons in his prime, his ages 28 to 30 seasons, when he probably would have been at his best. For my arch rival Red Sox, it's Ted Williams. Williams lost 3 full seasons to the Second World War and then gave up even more time to serve in Korea. As much as it pains me to admit this, a Ted Williams who had that time back might unanimously go down in history as the greatest hitter to ever play baseball. I've been a baseball stats nerd since I was a little boy who collected sports cards. And I don't remember when or where, but when I was very young, maybe 8 or 9 years old, I purchased a baseball almanac that dated all the way back to the beginning of the major leagues, and it was just full of statistics. And I was really fascinated by one name in particular. Many of those names, Ruth, Cobb, Wagner, Gehrig, and so on, came up over and over year after year. Meanwhile, there was a player for the Detroit Tigers whose name appeared with titanic individual achievements in certain seasons. 168 runs batted in 1935. 184 runs batted in 1937. 58 home runs. 58 in 1938. Hank Greenberg. It never occurred to me as a kid that he might have gone off and fought in the Second World War. I just wondered why this slugger, who put up single season numbers that rivaled Babe Ruth or Lou Gehrig, didn't show up on the same all-time leaderboards. Well, I know better now. Greenberg enlisted in the US military in 1941 after playing fewer than a dozen games that season. He then went on to miss 3 full seasons and returned halfway through the 1945 season. For all intents and purposes, Greenberg missed more than 4 full seasons of baseball, right at the end of his prime. And to give you an idea of what that prime looked like, between 1933 and 1940, Greenberg hit better than 300 in each of those seasons. had an on-base percentage of better than 400 and slugged better than 600 in each of them. It's maybe unreasonable to assume that Greenberg could have kept up that kind of torrid pace during the ages 30 to 34 seasons that he missed because of his wartime service. But even a conservative estimate of what his full stat line would look like is eye-opening. Greenberg retired with 331 home runs. Give him his missed 4+ seasons back, and that number would have been much closer to 500. Considering Greenberg hit 44 home runs in 1946 at the age of 1935, it's actually very possible he would have joined the mythical 500 home run club, and that club was pretty exclusive back in the day. Similarly, he retired with over 1,200 runs batted in. Greenberg was a machine when it came to bringing runners in off the bases during his time in the majors. With his missed seasons back, that career total is probably in the 1,800 range. As an adult baseball fan and a historian, I now know Greenberg better. He's one of baseball's great players. The only reason his career stat line doesn't reflect that is because he served his country in war for all or part of 5 separate seasons. And that's kind of what I'd like to talk about now, is his career and his wartime service before I move on to Tiby Eisen. Like a good historian, I'm going to try and disclose my sources to you throughout the lecture, just in case anyone wants to hunt them down and read further on them. For this section on Greenberg, my main source is the book that he collaborated on with sports journalist Ira Berkow. It's worth pointing out that, like other players of his era, World War II was not the only cataclysmic event Greenberg lived and played through in American history. Specifically, it did not take long for the Great Depression to make an impact on Greenberg's career. As a young man, he had more teams than just the Detroit Tigers trying to sign him. My beloved Yankees actually offered Hank $1,000 more than Detroit did if he'd go play in the Bronx. Greenberg, though, quote, had a look at Lou Gehrig and said no thank you, end quote. And the Washington Senators also offered the same amount as the Yankees did, $10,000. Ultimately, Greenberg took $9,000 to sign with the Detroit Tigers. Years later, he noted that he had no regrets about turning down the Yankees. Detroit's ballpark was much more friendly to right-handed hitters than Yankee Stadium was. As an example, left center field at Yankee Stadium during Greenberg's era extended out more than 460 feet, which is much, much deeper than any part of any ballpark in modern baseball. Greenberg received his first installment of pay from the Tigers, $6,000, in September of 1929. He had his father invest the money into the stock market. American Tobacco B got all of Hank's money. The next day, the stock jumped $800. A 13% return on investment in a single day is nothing to sneeze at. A month later, though, the Wall Street crash heralded the onset of the Great Depression, and Greenberg lost every penny he had invested in the stock market. His father was more upset than he was, though. Hank Greenberg himself was 100% focused on playing baseball. 2 years later, Greenberg was playing in the minor leagues in the Detroit system, and a couple of incidents around his salary indicate that while he hadn't been concerned with the market crash that wiped out his investments, he understood his worth as a ball player, and even as a young player and a young man, he was willing to fight for what he thought was right. During the 1931-1932 offseason, Greenberg wrote to the Tigers owner Frank Navin about his salary for the upcoming season. It's important to remember that baseball players at this point in history were at the absolute mercy of what's known as the reserve clause. Free agency and a player's ability to pursue something that at least looked like a free market was still decades away. The Tigers owner's response to Greenberg made it clear that Navin had no plans to bend to Greenberg's will regarding pay. Greenberg's initial letter, which I have not been able to see, must have referenced quitting baseball if he did not get an agreeable salary, because the Tigers owner gave Greenberg some advice in the return letter. Quote, "Don't write to any club owner telling him you are going to quit unless you are satisfied, because not one ball player in 1,000 quits, no matter what their salary is, at least until they have reached the major leagues. end quote. Greenberg and Navin continued this song and dance the next offseason. Navin sent Greenberg a contract offer for $500 a month for the 1933 season. Greenberg sent it back unsigned, not just because he was unhappy with the salary figure, but also because the Tigers wanted to move him to third base. Ultimately, the Tigers sent a new contract for $600 a month, and Greenberg signed that one. He debuted with the Tigers in the majors that season, 1933, and he gave a hint of what was to come. He hit .301 and drove in 85 runs in only 117 games. In one last instance of Greenberg's fighting for his value, Greenberg turned down a $4,500 major league contract from the Tigers. Greenberg thought he was worth $1,000 a month, $5,500 a year, and he was unwilling to budge off that. Ultimately, Navin offered Greenberg $5,000 guaranteed with a $500 bonus if the Tigers finished high enough in the standings. Greenberg compromised and signed the contract. As an aside, wow, how salaries in baseball have changed. For the next several years, with the exception of 1936 when he broke his wrist, more on that story in a minute, Greenberg tore up the American League. In 1934, he hit an amazing 63 doubles and 201 base hits. And in a sign of things to come, he drove in 139 runs. The very next season, Greenberg won his very first American League Most Valuable Player Award on the back of 36 home runs, 168 runs batted in, and 389 total bases. Greenberg's injury in 1936 was controversial, with some wondering whether the apparently dirty play that hurt him was racially motivated. Greenberg had gotten off to a great start that season, but in late April, in a game against Washington, the Senators' center fielder hit a ground ball to the second base hole. The runner seemed to run at Greenberg, collided with him, and then spiked him. The play broke Greenberg's wrist, and he missed the remainder of the season. Greenberg came roaring back in 1937, though, driving in a ton of runners, and there's a little bit of historical controversy over that exact number. Baseball Reference lists his total for that season at 184, which ties Lou Gehrig's 1931 season for the single-season American League record. A researcher, though, for SABR, the Society of American Baseball Researchers, found a mistake in the game logs from 1937 and credits Greenberg with one more run batted in, which would surpass Gehrig. In 1938, Greenberg's run batted in total dropped, but his prodigious power was on full display. Greenberg hit 58 home runs that season. To that point in baseball history, only Babe Ruth had ever hit more, and only Jimmy Fox could claim to even have tied Greenberg. To this day, 83 years later, only one right-handed hitter, Giancarlo Stanton, then of the Miami Marlins, has surpassed Greenberg's home run total without doing so under a cloud of performance-enhancing drug suspicion. Greenberg's 1939 season was a little bit of a slump by his otherworldly standards, but he came roaring back in 1940, the last full season he played until World War II came to a close. He led the American League in doubles, home runs, runs batted in, slugging percentage, on base and slugging percentage, total bases, and took home his second American League Most Valuable Player Award. Greenberg only played 2 more seasons, full seasons, after returning from the war, but it's a testament to his greatness that in one of them, his age 35 season in 1946, he looked like peak Hank Greenberg. That year, he led the American League in home runs, the 4th time he'd done so, and runs batted in, also the 4th time he'd done so. Throughout all of these seasons, Greenberg was playing in the shadow of the deteriorating situation in Europe. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, heralding the fall of the Weimar Republic that was born from the ashes of Imperial Germany's defeat in the First World War. In the years that followed, events in Europe portended a dark future, and not just for global geopolitics. The Nazi regime's oppression of its population, especially its Jewish population, intensified as they consolidated and remained in power. In 1938, as Greenberg pursued Babe Ruth's single-season home run record, he slowly came to a realization. He points out that no one until that point in time, especially ball players, expected war to break out. But as he put it, quote, "As time went by, I came to feel that if I, as a Jew, hit a home run, I was hitting one against Hitler," end quote. But hitting home runs was far from the only way that Greenberg fought back against the Nazi regime. In September 39, after the ultimate and spectacular failure of the appeasement policy that dominated European powers' interactions with Hitler, Great Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany, and the world entered a maelstrom of war that lasted for 6 years, and one, to be fair, that had already engulfed Asia after Japan invaded China earlier in the decade. The United States did not declare war immediately, but by early 1941, it was increasingly obvious that the United States was on a wartime footing that extended beyond its material support for the Allies. That spring, the draft board initially classified Greenberg as 4F due to, quote, "supreme flat feet," end quote. This classification played out poorly in the press, as reporters accused Greenberg of bribing his doctor to get a 4F classification. Ultimately, Greenberg decided his best course of action was to enter the draft and take his chances. He played his final game of the 1941 season on May 6th against the Yankees. After the game, his teammates, friends, and members of the Yankees threw him a going-away party, and the next morning, he was inducted into the United States Army at Fort Custer, Michigan, the 5th Division, 2nd Infantry Anti-Tank Company. His example resonated. In June 1941, a New York Times article detailed how North Carolina Senator Joshua Bailey held up Greenberg, quote, "as an example of young men inducted into the Army who had made a real sacrifice. To my mind, he's a bigger hero than when he was knocking home runs," end quote. By December of 1941, Greenberg had reached the rank of sergeant, and the Army had sent him home to Detroit, where he was preparing for the 1942 season. And then the world changed again. On December 7th, 1941, to borrow a phrase, a date which will live in infamy, Imperial Japan ambushed the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor. 2 days later, on December 9th, Greenberg told an Associated Press reporter that he was headed back to the Army and baseball was in his rearview mirror. Quote, "I have not been called back. I'm going back of my own accord," end quote, Greenberg told the reporter. He told another journalist, quote, "When he heard about Pearl Harbor, that settled it for me. I am re-enlisting at once," end quote. Sergeant Greenberg was the first big league ball player to enlist after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Star pitcher Bob Feller followed shortly after, and Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams followed after the 1942 season. This time, though, Greenberg decided he had had enough of the infantry. His enlistment was into the Army Air Force, eventually renamed the United States Air Force. He retained his rank of sergeant initially, but was commissioned as an officer, a second lieutenant, after 12 weeks at Officer Candidate School. The Army Air Force assigned him to the Flying Training Command out of Fort Worth, Texas, in the Special Services. From there, he spent the next year and a half traveling the country on inspection tours for aviation cadets, bombardiers, and gunners. Much like he had previously decided he was done with the infantry, in 1943, Greenberg decided he had had enough of Fort Worth and requested a transfer overseas where the action was. His assignment? The first group of B-29 Super Fortress bombers to be deployed. Second Lieutenant Greenberg spent 6 months in India preparing and training. Following that, he was assigned to China, where he spent the majority of the rest of his service. On his return to the United States, Second Lieutenant Greenberg received the Presidential Unit Citation and 4 Bronze Battle Stars. Ultimately, the Army Air Force discharged him on June 14, 1945, little more than a month after Germany surrendered and 2 months before Japan's capitulation ended the deadliest war in human history. Once back, Greenberg made an amazing return to Major League Baseball after more than 4 years away. After his retirement as a player, he stayed involved as farm system director, general manager, and eventually part owner of the Cleveland baseball team. He also spent time as the general manager of the White Sox, and he broadcast a game between the Yankees and the Baltimore Orioles for the television station ABC. In 1956, alongside Joe Cronin, Hank Greenberg took his place inside baseball's ultimate homage to greatness, the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. Greenberg received 85% of the votes cast for the Hall that year. John Rosenberg's article on Greenberg's service at the Baseball Hall of Fame website perhaps sums up Greenberg as a baseball player, a man, and a patriot better than my paltry words ever can. Quote, Hank Greenberg's baseball career made him a legend, but it was his military service that cemented his place as an American hero. End quote. I'm going to stay in the Second World War era for the next section of my talk, although I'm going to pivot away from Hank Greenberg and Major League Baseball. There's a large difference between best and favorite. As an example, Derek Jeter is my favorite Yankee, but I'd be hard-pressed to call him the best Yankee I've ever seen. Men like Alex Rodriguez, although he has some specific asterisks that need considered, and Mariano Rivera loom large in that dichotomy of best versus favorite. And so it is with baseball movies. My first semester at CU, I graded for my supervisor, Dr. Tom Zeiler, for his America Through Baseball history class. Students watched a plethora of baseball movies in that class, including 8 Men Out, Bull Durham, Moneyball, and The Natural. One of the movies they watched is my favorite baseball movie of all time, though I understand I might get in a fight trying to make a case for it as the best movie of all time. And it's A League of Their Own, starring Gina Davis, and telling the story of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League that sprung up during the Second World War. And no, it's not just my favorite because of Tom Hanks' spectacular delivery of "There's no crying in baseball," although that looms large as one of my favorite and one of the best movie quotes of all time. I saw that film for the first time when I was young, and it had told me a story I was unaware of. I had no idea, much like at the time I had no idea that major leaguers went off to fight in the war, that American women stepped in, filled the void, and gave America baseball. It's my personal opinion that America always needs baseball. This is perhaps a sign that I weathered COVID better than many, and I acknowledge that I'm very, very lucky to have survived COVID with very minimal symptoms and no long-term effects. But I profoundly felt the void left in my life without baseball during the early parts of the pandemic last year. 3/4 of a century ago, when baseball held a different place and a different centrality in American society and American life, I can only imagine how deeply the complete loss of baseball would have been felt by a nation that was still recovering from a decade-long depression and was now immersed in a world war, fighting on multiple fronts. During that war, not just in baseball, but across American society, women stepped to the fore as American men deployed to fight the Nazis in Europe and Imperial Japan in the Pacific. Entire sectors of the economy opened up to women, and some of the most recognizable American iconography of the Second World War, here I'm specifically thinking of Rosie the Riveter, directly related to the involvement of women in wartime society and the economy. Accordingly, women came from all walks of life to play professional ball in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League that replaced Major League Baseball during its hiatus. And I'd like to spend the next chunk of my time in this lecture discussing one of those women in particular, Thelma Tiby Eisen. Eisen played in the AAGPBL from 1944 until 1952. Half a century after she last laced up her glove for a game in that league, the National Jewish Sports Hall of Fame and Museum inducted her. She was born in 1922 to an Orthodox Jewish family, lived a long life, and passed away in 2014 at the age of 92. In 1944, a scout named Bill Allington came to Los Angeles looking for players to join the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Eisen worked at Lockheed at the time, and she was one of the 6 Los Angeles female ball players chosen to try out for the league. She played for multiple teams during her time in the AAGPBL, namely the Milwaukee Chicks, namely Milwaukee, Grand Rapids, Peoria, and Fort Wayne. Eisen played center field and was best known for her stolen base abilities. In 1945, Eisen was 4th in the league with 94 hits. She tied for 7th by scoring 44 runs, 2nd with 16 doubles, tied for 8th with 41 steals, and was 6th in batting average. And in the playoffs, she hit .357, but Grand Rapids lost in the first round. In 1946, she made the league's All-Star game. That season, she led the league in triples and stole an astounding 128 bases to finish second in the league. The next year, Peoria traded her to Fort Wayne for a player named Faye Dancer. And the significance of this trade is that Dancer served as the inspiration for Madonna's character, May Mortabito, in the film A League of Their Own. In 1948, Eisen toured Cuba as part of an all-star tour. The next year, in 1949, alongside another all-star team, Eisen embarked on a tour of Latin America. This latter tour aimed to create publicity and an international league of women's baseball. When Eisen left the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, her place as one of the league's great players was assured. Total Baseball lists her as one of the 20 greatest players in the history of the league, and Eisen ranks second all-time in stolen bases in league history, third in runs scored, and third in at-bats. And Eisen's impact goes beyond the baseball diamonds she played on. I mentioned above that she embarked on tours of Cuba and Latin America and was arguably one of the most prominent female baseball ambassadors in baseball history. And in wider American popular culture, she served as one of the inspirations that the filmmakers used when creating A League of Their Own's rich cast of characters. Eisen's cosmopolitan roots, she was a California girl, led her to identify herself as more sophisticated than many of the other players in the AAGPBL, some of whom came, for example, out of the rural Midwest. As A League of Their Own depicted, the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League brought in a beauty expert to teach the players about cosmetics and dress. The league wanted to differentiate its players from softball's reputation of mannish women, and the beauty expert's task was to impress upon the baseball players the importance of deporting themselves according to the feminine ideal of the time. Eisen is widely quoted in women's baseball literature as supporting this effort to feminize the players, although it was often ridiculed by others. She thought the Midwestern players needed to learn how to carry themselves and make a good impression. Eisen herself was quite glamorous. Living in California, she had been influenced by Hollywood, where her mother was an extra in some films, including the original version of the Ten Commandments. And at least as importantly, at least one scholar has identified her as an important figure whose atypical life, quote, gives us a window into a rarely noted world of Jewish working class women's enthusiasm for sport and other alternative careers, end quote. After her retirement, she continued to play ball, albeit not baseball. She returned to California. Eisen believed that softball was an inferior sport to baseball, but she nonetheless became a star center fielder for the Orange Lionettes softball team. She led the club to a world championship before retiring from softball in 1957. After her retirement, Eisen volunteered with Kids in Sports in the city of Orange. She was also active in the Alumni Association of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, serving as an officer and participating in their annual conventions. Eisen enjoyed her share of fame, especially in Jewish circles. She was inducted into the Southern California Jewish Sports Hall of Fame and the International Jewish Sports Hall of Fame in Comac, Long Island. In 1993, she helped establish a women's exhibit at the Baseball Hall of Fame. When asked why she wanted to do it, she replied, quote, "We're trying to record this so we'll have our place in history. It's important to keep our baseball league in the limelight. It gets pushed into the background, so people almost don't know it happened. Women have been pushed into the background forever. If they know about our league, perhaps in the future, some women will say, hey, maybe we can do it again," end quote. Eisen was one of the very few Jewish girls to play professionally in the AAGPBL. The exact number is disputed, but I have not seen a number higher than 4. As such, she undoubtedly blazed a trail for Jewish women in American sports in the mid-20th century. Eisen is nowhere near as well known as her male counterpart and contemporary Hank Greenberg, but it could be argued that her place in women's baseball is just as important as Greenberg's place in men's baseball. The very first baseball game I bought tickets to in Colorado was in the fall of 2018 when the Los Angeles Dodgers came to town. I've had a Major League Baseball TV subscription for close to 10 years. And for most of that time, when Clayton Kershaw of the Dodgers pitched, that was appointment viewing for me. I'd sometimes be mildly disappointed while watching him and think to myself, man, Kershaw sure doesn't have his best stuff going tonight. 2 years later, he'd leave the game with a stat line that was something like 7 innings, 4 hits, 1 run, 1 walk, and 9 strikeouts. His greatness was just ho-hum. So I made sure to grab tickets to the first start he had in Denver in September 2018, so I could check off my baseball bucket list that I saw Kershaw in person. 6 innings, 2 runs, 7 strikeouts, Dodgers win. Just another day at the office, and he hit a double, so that was kind of cool. As crazy as it is though, this future first ballot Hall of Famer and author of one of the most dominant 4-season pitching performances in modern history, I'd put him alongside Greg Maddux in the mid-90s, Pedro Martinez in the late 90s, and the man I'm about to talk about. Kershaw isn't even the greatest and or most celebrated and iconic pitcher in Dodgers history. And that's where we're going next, to that celebrated, iconic, semi-mythical Sandy Koufax. Koufax broke into the big leagues in 1955 with the Brooklyn Dodgers at the age of 19. And if you've never heard anything about Koufax and you just went and looked at his page on Baseball Reference's website, and you didn't look past his age 26 season, you would be forgiven for wondering what the hullabaloo is about Sandy Koufax. Sure, he was pretty good in 1961 when he led the National League in strikeouts, and then in 1962 when he led the NL in earned run average. But by then he was 26, and there was little reason to think he would one day be a legendary hurler to whom all greats who followed have had to endure comparison. And then 1963 arrived, and Sandy Koufax turned into Sandy Koufax. By the end of that season, the National League pitching leaderboard just read Koufax everywhere. Wins, earned run average, shutouts, strikeouts, modern metrics like fielding independent pitching, walks and hits per 9 innings, strikeout to walk ratio. There was black ink all over the place that just read Koufax. And then he followed that up with another dominant campaign in 1964, and another scintillating season in 1965, and another brilliant performance in 1966. When the smoke cleared on that 4-year stretch, he had built the resume of an inner circle Hall of Famer, one whose career peak seems unattainable, and has proven in the decades since to be generationally rare. Koufax, Maddux, Martinez, Kershaw. I'm blessed enough to have watched all except for Koufax, the original of the group. His brilliance was not limited to the regular season either. In 1963, long before baseball worried about league championship series, let alone wild card series and wild card games, the 2 league pennant winners immediately faced off in the World Series. In 1963, all that stood between Koufax and the Dodgers' 3rd championship since 1955 were my New York Yankees, baseball's Goliaths. Koufax's powers were on full display in that World Series. He started 2 games. He pitched every single inning in both of them and allowed a combined total of 3 runs. He struck out 23 Yankees. He only faced 69 of them. 1 in 3 went down without ever making contact. For his work, Koufax was the World Series MVP, and the Dodgers won the World Series. And 2 years later, in 1965, Koufax did it again, even better this time against the Twins. Koufax started 3 games. 2 of them were complete game shutouts. When he had finally finished throwing smoke, he finished that series with an earned run average of 0.38. He allowed 1 run in 24 innings, struck out 29, won another World Series, and another World Series MVP. And of course, it was the 1965 World Series that featured one of the defining and most well-known moments of Koufax's career, the conjunction of Game 1 of the World Series with Yom Kippur. Don Drysdale, Koufax's peer in the Dodgers rotation and peer in the Baseball Hall of Fame, ended up starting Game 1 of that World Series. Oceans of ink have been spilled talking about this, so I won't belabor the story. For anyone interested, the Baseball Hall of Fame's website has an article that discusses it. In a historical tie back to Hank Greenberg, though, the Baseball Hall of Fame says this, quote, Koufax's decision to not play on Yom Kippur was not without precedent, even though this time the holiday fell during the World Series. Detroit Tigers star Hank Greenberg won the hearts of Detroiters by playing and hitting 2 home runs on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, in 1934. Doing so helped lift the Tigers to the American League pennant, and with that out of the way, and still in the regular season, Greenberg opted to take the day off on Yom Kippur. Game 6 of the 1935 World Series fell on Yom Kippur, and Greenberg did not play, but that was largely due to a wrist injury suffered in Game 2. End quote. Decades later, there are echoes of Greenberg with Koufax. I'd also feel very remiss if I didn't mention a specific start from Koufax in 1965 in the regular season on September 9th. It's only fitting that one of baseball's mythical figures threw a perfect game during arguably the best season of his career. And the coverage of that start illustrates just how important Sandy Koufax was to baseball. On that day, the Dodgers faced the Chicago Cubs. The game was a nail biter all the way to the end, which makes Koufax's brilliance even more impressive. He had zero margin of error in his bid for pitching immortality. When the dust settled, the Dodgers won the game 1-0. Koufax finished with a whole bunch of zeros in his pitching line, along with a 9 at innings pitched and 14 at strikeouts, which seems really good. And in its coverage of that start, the New York Times revealed some startling statistics that clearly indicate just how important Sandy Koufax was to National League Baseball. To that point in the 1965 season, Koufax had started 35 games. 1.284 million fans had entered into stadiums in which he pitched on the day he pitched. That represented more than 10% of all National League attendance to that point in the season. Better than 1 in 10 fans who went to baseball games that year went to games when Sandy Koufax pitched. Perhaps even more startling is the average attendance for a start by Sandy Koufax. The average start in 1965 by Koufax averaged over 36,000 fans. League-wide, that number was less than half. 15,000 fans, roughly, attended games that Koufax did not pitch. 36,000, on average, attended the ones he did. Remove his data points, and the league average would fall even further, widening the gap between how many people went to watch Sandy Koufax and how many people went to watch everyone else. Much like Clayton Kershaw was appointment viewing for me back in Canada on MLB TV, Sandy Koufax was appointment viewing for baseball fans in person during his career. And as for his perfect game, it was his first perfect game, but it was his 4th no-hitter overall. Not bad. Not bad at all. Koufax, like Greenberg and Eisen before him, also saw his impact go far beyond the diamond. In fact, historian David Kaufman uses Koufax as one of his 4 case studies through which to examine Jewishness and Jewish celebrity in 1960s America. For anyone interested in that particular work, it is called Jewhooing the 60s, American Celebrity and Jewish Identity, Sandy Koufax, Lenny Bruce, Bob Dylan, and Barbra Streisand. More recently, Major League Baseball has also featured prominent Jewish players. Shawn Green, a former Toronto Blue Jay, is one of them. Green was born in 1972 and debuted with the Blue Jays in September 1993, the year the Jays won their 2nd of 2 straight World Series titles. Kevin was 12 that year, for reference sake. Green became one of the youngest players in the majors when he debuted that year. 1995 was Green's actual rookie season, and by 1998, he was a fixture in the Toronto lineup. In 1999, he became only the 4th player to hit a home run into the 5th deck of the Sky Dome, Toronto's home ballpark. The monster home run measured an estimated distance of 449 feet. That same year, he was selected to the All-Star game and performed in the annual Home Run Derby. In November of 1999, the Blue Jays traded Green to the Los Angeles Dodgers. There, Green played for 5 seasons, earning an All-Star game selection in 2002. That year, he also hit 4 home runs in 1 game, becoming only the 14th player in Major League history to accomplish the feat. In an echo of Koufax decades earlier, in September 2001, Shawn announced he would not play on Yom Kippur because he considered himself, quote, a role model in sports for Jewish kids, end quote. Green felt that being Jewish, quote, is something different, and I understand that. Throughout my career, it'll be something that differentiates me from other players, always separates me, end quote. When he retired, he did so with 328 home runs, including a monstrous 2001 when he smashed 49 of them. He also retired with over 1,000 runs scored and 1,000 runs batted in and more than 2,000 hits. In 2005, Green was inducted into the National Jewish Sports Hall of Fame, and in 2014, he was enshrined in the International Jewish Sports Hall of Fame. And this Canadian, who was approaching his teenage years when Green debuted with the Jays, has very fond memories of Sean Green in the years after the Jays won their World Series. It hurts me a lot as a Yankees fan to close this out talking about Houston Astros. But I think the case is pretty strong that the current standard for Jewish baseball players in the majors is Astros third baseman Alex Bregman. I guess it could be worse for me though. The Boston Red Sox originally drafted the player that my close friend and fellow Ph.D. student Kim Jackson affectionately calls Breggy. Bregman, though, chose to forego minor league baseball, went to college, and then the Astros selected him in the first round, second overall, in the 2015 draft. Bregman has been a mainstay in the Astros lineup since he debuted in 2016 at the age of 22. His offensive numbers have been eye-popping his entire career until this season, which has been marred by injury. He's been a little bit less prolific in the playoffs, but he has a World Series ring from 2017 and has still bashed 11 playoff home runs. It's entirely likely that if Bregman stays healthy and productive at third base, there's a very good chance he will someday join Hank Greenberg and Sandy Koufax in Cooperstown, enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Perhaps more importantly than Bregman's work on the diamond is his work off the diamond. He has embarked in notable and laudable civic engagement since he made it to the majors. His Bregman Cares organization has done excellent charitable work, both in Houston and across the United States. Bregman's charity launched a campaign to raise funds to feed Houstonians who have been impacted by the global COVID-19 pandemic. And to date, his efforts have raised over $1.5 million, an impressive number. Meanwhile, his partnership with Blue Spring Autism has raised over $250,000 in support of autism awareness. He also has an initiative underway to donate 1,000 quarantine food kits to the Houston Food Bank to ensure that students in need can receive free lunches. And to date, that has resulted in over $25,000 in food kits. Spanning decades and gender, Jewish baseball players have contributed to the rich history of America's national pastime. Hank Greenberg is a towering figure who spanned the 1930s and 1940s, and who I argue probably deserves even more credit for how great he was on the diamond, and who deserves even more recognition for his outstanding service to his nation during wartime. Thelma Tiby Eisen was a trailblazing figure for women's baseball, and from what I have been able to gather, stands as the greatest female Jewish baseball player, undisputably, if we're only looking at the wartime era when the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League played. Sandy Koufax still enchants the imagination over a half a century after he retired. He's one of the greatest pitchers in baseball history, and his career peak is the sort of thing that legends are made of. More recently, men like Sean Green and Alex Bregman have continued to follow in the footsteps of the legends who preceded them. Bregman, still active and hopefully with another decade in front of him, could well finish his career as an inner circle Hall of Fame third baseman, a position that has long been underrepresented in Cooperstown. As we come to a close today, I would finally like to once again express my gratitude for the opportunity to speak to you today. Baseball and history intersect two of my favorite things, and it was my privilege to have you listen to me drone on about them.